Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path, and I'm your host, Mike Allen. Today we're going to focus on Wethersfield. It was the first town in Connecticut to actually be settled by the English, but it wasn't necessarily the first town to have a population base of sorts. We're going to sort that out in just a moment. Our guest today is Martha Smart. Her last name says a lot about her because she's been the Research Librarian at the Wethersfield Historical Society for more than 50 years, starting as she did in the 1970s. She's going to be along in just a moment to share all of her incredible insights about the earliest days of European influx into our state. She's a fascinating woman with a lot of stories to tell. This week's trivia question: it flies, it drives, and it all started here in Connecticut. What invention are we talking about? Well, stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you're going to know the topic for next week's show. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is brought to you by our sponsor, Yale New Haven Health. When people need the best quality health care, there's a reason they turn to Yale New Haven Health. In 1826, Yale New Haven Hospital became Connecticut's very first hospital. They were the first hospital in the U.S. to use chemotherapy. Yale New Haven was the first to introduce insulin pumps for diabetic patients, and they introduced the world's first intensive care unit for newborns. For more information about Yale New Haven Health, visit ynhhs.org. That's ynhhs.org. The town of Wethersfield, arguably, is the oldest town in Connecticut, now at least in terms of European settlement, with heavy emphasis on that word settlement. You see, the first official settlement by the English in Connecticut was indeed in Wethersfield back in 1634, but the year before that, in 1633, another group of English had established a trading post nearby in the town that is today Windsor, and Windsor did go on to become a settlement as well. So there's a little bit of a disagreement that carries on to this very day, hanging on that word settlement, and whether that trading post in Windsor qualified as a settlement, and whether they should be considered number one or Wethersfield number one. Doesn't really matter, because either way, Wethersfield has a remarkable 400-year history all by itself, regardless of who came first. And, of course, in both cases, it was the Native Americans who had been here for thousands of years before the Europeans even arrived. Now, one key historical fact about Wethersfield: it was the first major Native American attack on a Connecticut settlement. It occurred there. The Pequot Nation attacked the town in April of 1637. It was pretty brutal, but the Pequots had been wrongly attacked by white settlers before that, so this was a revenge attack. And this came just 3 years after Wethersfield had been settled. Well, that attack led to a horrible revenge attack against the Pequots in present-day Mystic 1 month later in May of 1637, and an all-out slaughter occurred there. And another key historical fact about Wethersfield is that it's where a very important meeting occurred between General George Washington and French Commander Rochambeau. They met there to discuss how best to oust the British during the Revolutionary War. And you're going to hear a lot more tales about the town's history as we progress. Now, the area boasted fertile cropland. It was right on the banks of the Connecticut River, and you could just about grow anything there. It was inhabited by what were known as the River Indians, the Wangonk Indians. Well, then came the white settlers from the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and John Oldham led those settlers into what is today Wethersfield. He was a rough-and-tumble sort of settler. He was well-versed in how to live off the land. He knew how to scout for new land, and he knew how to survive in the wild. He was so rough and tumble that one time, there's a great story about him, he pulled a knife on none other than Miles Standish in the Plymouth colony in Massachusetts after Standish asked him to take a turn as a guard for the colony sites. Well, after that, Oldham left Plymouth colony, and he moved over to the other colony in the Bay State, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, from there, Oldham went south a couple of times, making investigatory sojourns, you might say, south into Connecticut. And at the time, the Dutch were the only ones who had a foothold in the middle of Connecticut, other than, of course, the Native Americans. They had established a trading post on the Connecticut River near where Hartford is today. Now, the River Indians had come up to Massachusetts, to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and actually invited them to come to Connecticut because they wanted to trade with them, but the colony leaders said no. That didn't stop Oldham. He made trips to the Wethersfield area on his own and finally took some others with him and made the settlement. We're going to pick up the story now with Martha Smart. She's the Research Librarian at the Wethersfield Historical Society and has been for the past 50 years. Martha, when you talk about Wethersfield, I think you start at the beginning, which, at least from the European settlement point of view, dates back, as far as we know, to 1634, when these 10 men called the 10 Adventurers came into the Broad Street area of Wethersfield and settled it. For settlements, this was the first settlement by English settlers in Connecticut. Tell us, what do we know about what the conditions were like?
You have to go back and look at what the situation was with the Native Americans and the Europeans. You had the English in Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth, which was a separate colony. You had the Dutch in New York, what is now New York. You had Roger Williams from what became Rhode Island. The area of the Sound was kind of an open frontier. Different Native American tribes, the Dutch, the English in several different colonies, all vying for trade and land. The English were especially, and Dutch, interested in furs. The Indians were interested in the artifacts they could get from the English and the Dutch, tools, blankets. So if you think of it in that regard, and Massachusetts Bay said, well, we're not interested at this time. This was after Oldham had made a preliminary visit to the Connecticut River Valley, and he came back with glowing reports, and still Massachusetts Bay said they weren't interested. So without permission or any say-so from Massachusetts, he took 10 adventurers with him and to the area that is now Wethersfield.
So now this is 1634 that the 10 adventurers get there. By 1635, they're sending a second round of migration to the town. And then in 1637, this is when the Pequots attack Wethersfield. What do we know about that?
In 1636, Oldham, who was a trader, and he had a kind of an agreement with the Rhode Island Indians to trade with them. But the Indians at Block Island murdered him. And another Englishman had sailed up, fired at them. When they boarded the ship, they found Oldham's body, which was still warm. Now, Massachusetts Bay chose to blame the Pequots for that. And the Pequots really had nothing to do with it. They said, well, you get us the killers. And they said, well, we don't have the killers. And Massachusetts sent troops down to the Sound. They burned villages, they burned their crops, they stole things. Well, the Pequots are out for revenge. And Wethersfield was the nearest English settlement. So one night they came up the river and attacked and killed 9 people, I guess. That's the most we can determine anyway. And carried off 2 girls. And they were redeemed by the Dutch.
Now let's move on in Wethersfield's development. Well, one of the things I heard was that Wethersfield's great crop, for which it's known, the red onion, that for many, many years, this was considered a delicacy or an important trading item in the West Indies. And in return for that, Wethersfield would get rum.
We were not only shipping the red onion to the West Indies, we were shipping grain, we were shipping potatoes, we were shipping salted beef, salted pork, salted fish. And in return, we were bringing back sugar, molasses. It was very important because you made rum from it, and they also used it as a sweetener. Anyway, they were bringing back these items plus salt. We were getting salt from the West Indies. And we were shipping a lot of horses to the West Indies, as well as cattle. Horses were, again, used in the processing of sugar. The thing with the West Indies is they didn't raise food. They raised sugar, which was a very important money crop.
Now, in Wethersfield, in the 1600s, I'd say probably the 1640s, 1650s, the whole issue with witches, which became an issue in Connecticut long before Salem, Massachusetts, I understand there was some sort of fever or drought or maybe a combination of the two that caused people to suspect that witchcraft was being practiced in town. Do I have that right?
Yeah, they had some bad years for crops. And then they had what was called an epidemical sickness that came through. Boston had it. It sounded a lot when they described the symptoms like the Spanish flu. It killed off a lot of people. In 1 year, the town of Windsor, which we have the best figures for, 50 people died in the course of 1 year. Normally, about 5 people died. So when you're talking about maybe 90 families in a place and 50 people dying, that's a lot. Not only that, but it killed off Leonard Chester, who was the leader here. It killed off the minister, and it killed off Thomas Hooker, who was the leader of the colony, all about the same time from that sickness. Bad things were happening. God had let Satan loose because he was punishing his people. And the human agent of the devil is a witch. And the first witch was Alice Young up in Windsor, hanged for a witch. Mary Johnson here in Wethersfield was the second one. And then that was followed fairly soon by the Carringtons, a husband and wife, who were hanged for witchcraft. They hanged them here. They did not burn them like they did in Europe because that smacked too much of the Inquisition.
What can you tell me about the great story from 1758 when somebody planted a tree that would come to be known as the Great Elm?
That was the Smith property. One of the Smiths, as a young man, had dug up or pulled up a sapling or a very small sapling, it must have been, and used it to drive the cows home. And then his mother or somebody planted it in the front yard. And that became the Great Elm.
Now, I understand that it grew to be almost 100 feet tall, had a circumference of 30 feet, and I guess you call it a leaf spread of 150 feet. It was described at one point as the tallest elm in America. That's amazing.
Yes, it was a massive tree. When you look at pictures of it, it dwarfs the houses around it. And, of course, it succumbed to the Dutch elm disease.
Let's talk for just a second about this. I'll call it a friendly rivalry between Wethersfield and Windsor, although I know some people take this actually very seriously and wouldn't necessarily call it a friendly rivalry. But Windsor, I guess maybe 10 months before the 10 adventurers settled Wethersfield, set up a trading post, which then, continued, and finally the town did settle. How do you come down on this?
Well, if you want to know the truth, I think it's a stupid argument. It's neither here nor there. By 1636, the towns of Windsor, Wethersfield, and Hartford had been settled. And why argue over, something like that? I will tell you the backstory of that trading post at Windsor. Plymouth Colony decided they were coming over here and going up the river and establishing a trading post because they needed money. And they thought, well, the fur trade, they'll get it that way. Well, guess what? Before they got here, the Dutch had established a trading post at Hartford, and there was a bit of a problem. Well, they got upriver, they established their trading post. Remember, this was Plymouth Colony. Well, a bunch of people from Dorchester in Massachusetts Bay Colony came over later and decided they were going to settle there. And the Plymouth people complained bitterly to Massachusetts Bay. This is our land. What are these people doing here? So that's the background of Windsor's settlement. And the truth is, a lot of people They had a terrible, terrible time up there when they first settled the Windsor. A lot of people died and a lot of people left. So basically, I think it's a foolish argument. That's my opinion.
So, Martha, I know you have some strong feelings about Wethersfield's history as it relates to the entire topic of slavery. Maybe you could tell us about your thoughts on that?
We were supporting slavery in the West Indies by our trade. And after the Pequot War, the stated policy of Massachusetts Bay and Connecticut, which were the victors in that war, was to take the Pequot men and sell them into slavery into the West Indies and maybe even as far as Europe. And they even passed a law that said anybody that aided and abetted these Indians would also be sold into slavery. They brought black slaves from the West Indies to replace them, and they sold the women and children into slavery. The first black slave we have a notice of was in 1648 with Leonard Chester's death. He left a black Negro maid meaning young woman. And not too long after that, one of the Lattimores died, and he left not only Negro slaves, but a woman and her child. So I have given tours of the burying ground, and I always start out with the so-called slave stones. And I've had people who grew up in Wethersfield say, I didn't know we had slavery. And we had kind of amnesia about that slavery in the colonial revival period from 1876 up until the present day, really. Everybody was writing the history of their family and how wonderful the history of Wethersfield was, blah, 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 never even mentioning the fact that slaves helped build this town and that our trade very much depended on slavery. That is something we need to really emphasize.
That nagging issue of which town in Connecticut is in fact the oldest is considered really a non-issue by both the Windsor and Wethersfield Historical Societies, yet they obviously can still have some fun with it because one of the members of the Wethersfield Historical Society told me that they received a package from the Windsor Historical Society. The box was addressed to Old Wethersfield. The return address, Older Windsor. That wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. Wethersfield is not only known for its history with red onions, it was also for about 60 years the leading supplier of crop seeds for farmers and gardeners throughout the United States. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Martha Smart, longtime research librarian for the Wethersfield Historical Society. The answer to this week's trivia question, the question was, it flies, it drives, and it all started in Connecticut. What invention are we talking about? It was the amphibian, the only flying car approved by the FAA for commercial use. Next week on Amazing Tales CT, we're going to tell you the amazing story behind the Connecticut man who invented the amphibian, what happened to it, and all the other amazing inventions he gave us. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and please stay healthy.